right, Tim McDonnell, climate and energy editor at Semafor, speaking to us on D-Day from Kyiv. Welcome to Wicked Problems.
Thank you so much for having me. A pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. I mean, you're a guy with a lot going on. Never mind covering the entire climate and energy beat, which is just about everything. So you've got that, plus you're in Ukraine. So let's just start there. I mean, you've been reporting from all over the world. You've reported from Bangladesh, from Nigeria, from DC. Let's get straight to it. What is it like reporting from Kyiv on a global beat?
So I mean, my wife is the Ukraine correspondent for the Washington Post, so that's sort of our immediate reason for being here, and so I'm kind of tagging along behind on that journey this time, and but also still dedicating a lot of attention to the huge energy story that's unfolding here. I mean, this week we've started to have power cuts that have been getting much worse than they even were before. I mean, I think this is sort of the worst time for power outages in the country, or at least in Kyiv, since last winter, when it was really quite bad. And we're fortunate now that the weather is nice, so it's not nobody's freezing or anything, which that was the case before. But it still is it's a frustrating thing to have to deal with. And I mean, Russia's strategy for hitting all of this energy infrastructure, and they've been really stepping up their attacks on transformers and power plants. And, Ukraine has basically lost more than half of its electricity infrastructure since the war started. Almost every power plant has been hit, at one point. They're sort of down to relying on a few nuclear power plants that are still working. But the strategy behind that is to really just disrupt average people's lives and make it difficult to live and really affect people's morale. And I think that's working. It certainly is very frustrating for us. So that's just kind of one thing that we're dealing with now. And it puts Ukraine in a very difficult situation. You can't build this stuff overnight. I mean, even as the US or Europe, know now, as we're going into this period of, an explosion in demand for power all over the world, whether it's from coming from fossil fuels or renewables or whatever, it takes time to build this stuff, and a lot of money, and it's it's bureaucratically complicated. So I mean, when you're trying to do that in wartime, and a lot of the infrastructure that they need to rebuild here is old stuff that dates back to like Soviet times, and you can't even get parts for things most of the time. And obviously the country is just totally cash strapped because they have a lot, so much is going towards the war effort. They just don't have the manpower or financial resources to rebuild this infrastructure. So I think even now, I was saying the weather is nice, the sun is shining, but we're I think people are really starting to worry about what this winter is going to be like, because I don't think they're going to be able to rebuild most of it, in the next 6 months. So by the time it starts to get cold here, it will become even more of a serious problem. So that's something to watch going forward.
And I have to ask again, forgive me, a little bit off your beat, but I mean, the mood there, obviously we've had several reversals on the front lines over the last few months. The counteroffensive didn't make the progress that was hoped for. People were, bullish about American support coming in. Then we had this long, lengthy delay held up in Congress. So, I mean, is there, you've been there for a good portion of the conflict. Has the situation in terms of morale, is it materially changing? Is, Zelensky's support, who, of course, his term expired, didn't it? So they can't even hold an election. So everything just feels very much in the balance at the moment for me sitting here in London.
Yeah. I mean, the mood is definitely not great, and there's a lot of anxiety and, I think exhaustion and just, some fear about where things are going. And yeah, I mean, people were really on tenterhooks waiting for that U.S. aid package to come through. Fortunately, it did. That helps a lot. Then, there was this big debate happening in the last couple of weeks about whether Ukraine can use U.S. weapons to strike targets inside of Russia, and which the Biden administration, has now allowed, but only in kind of very limited proscribed circumstances. So that could help. But I mean, all of that really, was really just to sort of hold the line. I mean, they're at this, they're under just relentless bombardment from Russia, very much overmatched in terms of resources. So, this sort of U.S. aid was essential just for kind of maintaining a baseline defensively. And then, if you talk about what's required to go offensive or to try to push Russia back, I mean, it's a whole other level of support that still isn't there. So I think, there's a summit happening in Berlin next week. We'll see if there's any kind of progress on more aid from Europe or the US that comes out of that. And Ukraine, but I think people are very, very exhausted, and they're having these conversations about lowering the draft age, even taking draftees out of prisons, like convicts, enlisting them, and trying to just get more people any way that they can. And so it's really concerning situation. And it's this whole generation of young people that are caught up in this thing, and it's totally disruptive to the whole fabric of societies. It's a scary time, and it's not clear what the year ahead really holds. So we'll have to see.
And as I said at the top, I mean, you've reported from all sorts of places around the world, and you got into journalism about the time that I left my first tour as a journalist back in 2010. So tell me, what's it been like? Tell me from the beginning. You decided to study journalism, and then you've had this. Your byline has been everywhere: Wired, the New York Times, Mother Jones, Quartz. You look like you've been everywhere. And Nat Geo, of course, having the fellowships there. So tell us your story. Like, how did you get from where you started to there in Kyiv?
Well, very, very brief life history. I mean, so I studied environmental science and worked for the student newspaper as an undergraduate, and in Arizona, University of Arizona. And then I was an intern at the Sierra Club magazine for a little bit after college, living in San Francisco. And then I jumped over to Mother Jones. And when I was working at Mother Jones, I had an editor who kind of encouraged me to sort of reframe my thinking around the environment beat as more about to sort of think of myself as a business reporter rather than kind of like a science reporter, which is sort of how I had viewed myself previously. And I think that was a really helpful kind of insight for how I frame the coverage that I do, and starting to look more at energy markets and the energy transition, the renewable energy transition, and covering fossil fuel companies and sort of all the politics that is baked into all of that. And that was at a time when climate change as a news subject was not new, but kind of still on the periphery to some extent, and hadn't really been mainstreamed in the same way. And I think there was still very often just represented as like, the scientist says this, another person says something, these very like kind of stilted, not very nuanced conversations.
Yeah.
He said, she said kind of thing. And it's really evolved so much since then and become much more nuanced and detailed. And now you have I've seen in the last decade, there's a lot more people, a lot more journalists like doing what I do. There's a lot of us like this big community of people who are in this space, who are, kind of dedicated climate and energy reporters, which didn't used to be the case. I mean, it was a much rarer breed when I started, which I think is great. Like that's the way it should be. And this is a story that touches on all aspects of society. So, yeah. And so, to get back to my story, I guess I worked for Mother Jones for 5 or 6 years, and then I was a Fulbright fellow and bounced around a few places in Sub-Saharan Africa for about 2 years doing that Fulbright, which was kind of mainly focused on food security and climate change and the food system and agriculture. And then as a freelancer for a little bit, mostly based out of Nigeria, writing for New York Times and some other places, still with a kind of energy and agriculture mainly focus. And yeah, and then came back to DC, met my wife, who was at the Washington Post. And so we were based in DC for her job for a couple of years. And then we were always sort of pushing, like, how do we figure out a way to get back based abroad? Because, for different reasons, we both like have this interest in kind of global news and what's happening around the world. And so we were just kind of waiting for the right moment to jump out for that. And then, of course, then the pandemic happened, so everything got kind of put on ice, or for a year or so because of that. But then, and then we moved to Cairo. We were based in Cairo for 2 years. Then, when the war started here, my wife started spending more time here in Ukraine, covering this conflict. So then, eventually, we just decided to come over here. So I have had the opportunity to get to cover this climate story from many different perspectives and different parts of the world. And it's a great privilege to get to kind of see this story from the viewpoints of, both the politicians and CEOs that are making, important consequential decisions about, for better or for worse, for the energy transition, but also from, frontline communities in some of the very poorest parts of the world who are really living through climate change impacts and having to deal with that in their daily lives. And I try to bring all of that sensibility into the stories that I do now for Semafor.
And I think it's something that your coverage, again, I think reflects that. I mean, we had Akshat Rathi from Bloomberg on the show talking about his book, Climate Capitalism. And I think, what it was, a lot of our discussion was about having this perspective that isn't coming from, the traditional J school or science-based or just from the West, perspective fully, and covering it from that lens. And I think it, like when he foregrounds Wan Gong instead of Elon Musk as the first chapter, and you have to go 3 chapters in before you come across basically a pale white dude based in the West that you've read about before. And so I think it's essential for how this stuff gets covered, and I think your coverage is terrific for that. I think that it's also, I'm interested to get your views, because again, we touched on it a little bit about the energy side of your beat. I think we kind of traded notes, and I want to be a little bit careful here, but careful listeners will know that I had Baker Hughes as a client in a former life. I saw that you had gone to Florence for their annual meeting earlier this year. I found it to be just a fascinating view, and particularly that year. This was the last year, when you could just tell the traditional energy industry was really on its uppers. They were like, yeah, we're back, baby. Ukraine's put us back right in the driving seat. And they were so bullish. Mm-hmm. What was the mood like this year?
Still like that, I think. It was really interesting to be there in Florence and see the sort of energy behind, it felt like, even though we are having this conversation about this energy transition, I mean, and there's a lot of talk about renewables. I mean, this oil and gas, the traditional oil and gas industry still has a lot of work to do ahead. I mean, even in the most kind of rapid or optimistic energy transition scenario, there's decades more work that has to be done for oil and gas. And I think there was a feeling, I think these companies are trying to figure out how to work in that space, and they see opportunities for themselves there. I mean, when I was in Florence for the Baker Hughes conference this year, hydrogen was the big thing that everybody was talking about, and they had these kind of turbines, these gas turbines on display there that are their new gas turbines that they've developed that can also run on hydrogen. Trying to figure out how do we sort of reposition our products to take advantage of this transition. And I mean, one thing I was just sort of struck by, walking around in this conference hall, was just to be reminded again of the scale of some of the hardware and infrastructure that we're talking about here. I mean, these are just massive, complicated, expensive machines, and it just is a reminder that we can't change all of this stuff overnight, and also just a reminder of how much kind of sunk investment goes into the status quo, which is not to say that that's not a reason to change, but
Sure.
you just to get a sense of like how complicated or like the challenge that's there. So, and I think for on the hydrogen front with Baker Hughes, I mean, there's a sort of uh, there's a bit of a sort of gamble that it has to be made here, because nobody really knows what the pace of change is going to be. We don't really know how much hydrogen we're going to use in the future, how expensive that's going to be compared to natural gas, or where it's going to come from, who's going to be using it exactly. And so we're all sort of looking ahead to this a future where there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's going to be a lot of change in this energy market that really for the last 50, 60, maybe more years has really not changed that much. I mean, has been pretty static in terms of how much energy we're using and kind of where it comes from. And so now we're just moving into this period of crazy uncertainty and volatility in energy that is really unprecedented, I think. So just to kind of see how different companies are trying to navigate that, that's a big part of like what I cover at Semafor.
I mean, I think it's interesting as somebody, when you were writing for the Sierra Club, I wondered if you ever imagined you'd be going to a conference like that in Florence with a bunch of the oil and gas heads. But what would younger you say to yourself now?
I would like to think that, I've tried to maintain a very open perspective about, or an open aperture for all of this information. I really resist viewing myself as a climate activist, and I don't, I think it's important to maintain an ear and a finger on the pulse and communication lines of communication with the oil and gas industry, because just because they are a part of the story, whether you like it or not, and it's important to know what's going on there. And so, I'm not like, I'm not signing up to, do work for Baker Hughes or something like that. But, I think it is important to attend these types of conferences and see what's going on there, just to kind of get a sense of what their position is.
Absolutely. And again, I have to disclose, because again, having done work for them in the past, it's, would only be right to make sure that people are aware of that. So I'm not going to say too much more about that, but I do think what's interesting is, because I agree with you. I mean, when I was a business editor of a newspaper in Ireland, we started covering what was then labeled green tech without it being kind of a oxymoron. It was something that covering it as a business proposition was pretty novel at the time. This is like 2006. So like this is a really long time ago. And I think but I think that framing has always stuck with me as the right one to understand the big picture about where all these intersections happen, both with that and on the policy side. And I think that's whether I really enjoy reading your work and Semafor more broadly, is that it just, as a product, it kind of just has that, I just feel at home in terms of the framing that it takes on a lot of this stuff. And I think even, so tell me a little bit about how you choose, stories we're going to cover. We're in a big week, right? We've had the Bonn conference is going on. We've had Guterres of the UN come out and talk about, the 80% chance that we're going to breach 1.5 again in the next 5 years, for at least 1 year. And that, he's calling for a global ban on fossil fuel advertising. We're hoping to get some, so like, how do you pick? There's so much happening across the entire spectrum. How do you decide what to prioritize and what do you cover?
Honestly, it is, it's kind of overwhelming time to be on this beat. And I just try to do the best that I can to make decisions in a really short, time frame. And there's always stuff that that kind of gets past me or that I miss, because there's just too much going on. I mean, we've tried a couple different, tweaks to the formatting of the newsletter to allow it to kind of capture, more of the kind of underlying, more of the storylines that are kind of moving past. And then I have to just, at some point you have to just make a decision about, what do I think is a story happening this week that I, can pick up on and add some kind of insightful commentary or add a scoop or from someone who's, in the midst of this. And honestly, there's not really like a secret to it. I just have to kind of come in every morning and say, okay, like what's out there, what's happening, what have I kind of got in the bag? And I feel like usually what I do is like from one day to the next, I'm just continually observing and having conversations with people. And then by the time that I get to like my deadline to send the newsletter on Wednesday and Friday mornings, I just have to look at sort of what's on my desk and make a decision about what I've got and figure out a way to organize it and send it out. And that's just sort of like one of the challenges of this job. And so it does tend to be, that's the nice thing about these like newsletter formats is that it actually has a lot of space for different stuff. I don't have to just fixate on like one story and spend a week working on that at the, I can be a little bit like more comprehensive. And most of the stuff that I write for this newsletter it's not super long. So, it just gives me more like flexibility to kind of hit on different stuff at the same time. But I always feel like there's stuff that's kind of getting past me.
Well, I think that's the nature of kind of being conscientious about your job is actually you do worry about these things. You're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything. I mean, in the newsletter yesterday, you were. I mean, I think was really interesting. I wasn't even aware of this Climate Nexus comm shop, which is probably bad on me. But you were. I think people were talking. You and others were talking about how can you possibly get through a COP without these guys around as you're looking forwards to Baku. So what was the role that a place like Climate Nexus played, and why should we be sorry that they're gone?
So the significance of a place like Climate Nexus was that they really did an amazing job of kind of bringing resources to journalists who are on this beat. And I mean, I had been following them or sort of, receiving their communications for the whole 13 years that they were in existence. And, I mean, this is like sort of like we were just talking about. This is a complicated beat with a lot going on. And it's really helpful to have, professional communicators who are sort of on hand with like, here's a list of people that you might want to call about this X topic that's in the news today. And so, they were just a really helpful resource for that. But I think like many environmental organizations recently have, they had some fundraising challenges. There were, Climate Nexus is closing. There were also layoffs at the Sierra Club, Environmental Defense Fund, a bunch of different NRDC, a bunch of different environmental organizations have had fundraising challenges over the last year, which is, I mean, it's kind of like, we're at this phase of like climate is now very much a mainstream topic and something that's very front of mind for more people, I think, than it ever has been, which would make you think that maybe it would be a good time to be fundraising in this space. But also, it's an area where it feels like both that we are kind of making incremental progress, and maybe that like turns off some funders who say, well, I don't really need to like deal with this because actually we are kind of doing it. And I think there are people for whom it does still feel kind of like a problem for tomorrow. I mean, it feels like something that's going to happen, some other time in the future, even though like we know that that's not true. And we know this is a problem for today. You can see signs of, just look at what's happening in the insurance market right now. It's very obvious that, these impacts are having an immediate impact on the economy today. But I think there is a kind of mentality that still in some circles that this is like something happening in the future. So that can also make it difficult to fundraise, I think. Going into COP, is always, I mean, COP, I've been to like 4 or 5 of them now, which by, there are people who have been to like all 28 of them, which I think is insane. And I don't, if we talk again in another 30 years and I've been to every single COP since then like I really need to do something different with my life. But when you go into like COP, I mean, it's very hectic and there's just a lot of like information flying all over the place. So I do still think there's an important role for kind of well-intentioned communications firms to like kind of help journalists navigate all this stuff, especially because there are still people who are trying to cover this beat who haven't been doing it for 10 years and don't really know a lot of the details of it. And there's a lot of jargon and like technical, it's kind of, this beat is like fairly technical. So you need to have some baseline knowledge about how stuff works to be able to ask informed questions as a journalist. So they were really helpful for that. And I was sorry to see them go.
Well, I mean, it sounds exactly like the sort of people that it would be a shame to lose. I mean, I think Covering Climate Now is doing a pretty good job of trying to, help journalists, particularly in the global south, to try to, get to a level of, both understanding how to distinguish between good information and bad information that's being put in front of them. So hopefully we collectively will keep ourselves honest and keep things moving in the right direction on that stuff. But also in your newsletter this week, I think you also quoted Will Burns in a piece that spoke off from the newsletter in terms of Climeworks and, the big flurry about DAC and casting. I mean, I like the fact that also you're given the space to give clearly demarcated, here's my view or here's my take versus here's the straight news reporting, which I think is a really smart way of dividing it up. And I think, your analysis is really interesting. I think a lot of us have looked at the amount of money that's gone into Climeworks and other DAC versus, other CDR pathways, and are just wondering, are those numbers really gonna stack up? And I hadn't seen it originally in the original form, but your quote from Cobalt guy about the catastrophically stupid nature of putting any money into DAC versus doing other kind of CCS was so. Yeah, it feels like, I think fair to say that you're not a flag waving believer in the Climeworks story or any story, because you shouldn't be as a journalist. But it's interesting to see how Würzbach parries some of these questions and whether or not they're going to hit a wall at some point. They put an ad in the New York Times, I think last year, didn't they? Like inviting punters, to buy CDR credits with them. I just wonder. I guess I get kind of a little bit, feel a little bit weirded out by that.
Yeah, that whole the carbon removal space, I think is really interesting, and it's sort of this just multifaceted math problem almost of we have a limited amount there's some limited amount of money that's available for climate solutions, which include, replacing fossil fuels with cleaner alternatives now so that we reduce the amount of emissions. And then in the future, there's going to be some chunk of emissions that's left over that we're going to have to do something about. And I think there's quite widespread agreement that chunk of leftover emissions will exist. And is something that we need to be thinking about. How big that chunk is very much unknown. What is the right allocation of resources to addressing that? Because the concern that some people have with direct air capture projects like Climeworks is that it's a question of, if you have to spend $800 per ton to capture, to draw down emissions in that way, how many millions of dollars are you diverting from other types of technologies to either stop or reduce emissions that may be more effective? This is it's sort of like the far end of the spectrum of very expensive technocratic kind of gee whiz type climate solutions. And which is not to say that there's no role for that at all, but if you're trying to think about what's the greatest impact we can have as quickly as possible, because we're on very much a time crunch for all of this. I think that, that's just where there's a lot of uncertainty. And it used to be the case even, a year or two ago. I think a lot of these carbon removal startups, there's this sort of holy grail number of $100 per ton of removal. And this is the thing that people have been saying for years. Once we get down to $100 per ton, then it's really cost competitive, and it makes a ton of sense to do that. And it's at that point you actually, it kind of becomes this sort of security backstop. Okay, well, we can actually afford then to move maybe a little bit slower on phasing out fossil fuels, because we're going to have this affordable, effective alternative approach of drawing down carbon in the sort of late 2030s, 2040 timeframe. But even this week, when Climeworks was talking about this innovation, which is very exciting and cool to see, they think they can capture carbon from the atmosphere for half the price that it was before, using half the energy, get twice as much carbon. I mean, they are making progress, but even the numbers that they were sharing with us this week, their forecast even by 2050 is still above $200 a ton. It's like $250 per ton, even in 2050. So, $100 per ton is like off the table basically. And so, it just makes you sort of wonder, how much can or should we really count on this technology? And I think the real takeaway from all of this is just like, look, we're probably going to need some carbon removal in the future, and we need to kind of have something kind of churning in the background to maybe, help push this industry along. But the real focus has got to remain on cutting emissions now by reducing fossil fuel consumption as quickly as possible. That remains the overweening imperative for the economy. And, unless there's some incredible technological breakthrough that, even the big breakthrough that Climeworks had this week does not change that calculus at all. So, I think that's kind of the takeaway here. Yeah.
Well, I think it probably will continue to get an outsized amount of attention because, again, there is this gee whiz tech bro kind of fantasy element to it, which is cool. It's cool, right? Yeah. I want it to work. We all want it to work. It's whether it can work is the other question, and whether or not people will be transparent about their numbers.
Or whether it should work. That's kind of the question.
Yeah, there are certainly critics who think that, there's mitigation deterrence. People talk about that, and you're just avoiding having to make these kind of putting off decisions that you should be making now about decarbonizing other things. I think people do speak similar ways about hydrogen. Going back to Baker Hughes, the amount of abatement that is credited to hydrogen being a replacement fuel in the IEA net zero scenario, I think is like 8 gigatons of CO2, which is that's a huge chunk of what's expected. And given the numbers on hydrogen, I've been hearing about hydrogen since I was in New York in the 90s, consulting with companies who are we have fuel cell cars. It's going to be a fuel cell car by next year. It's going to be amazing. It's going to transform automobile. It's just not happening. It's just not. We're not doing it for home heating. Even the UK has abandoned its trial. Even the conservative government here, who desperately wanted it to be a thing. The folks at Macquarie who are buying up Cadent and other northern gas networks to be able to say we're going to buy all these gas assets because we can flip them into hydrogen. And now they're stuck with some stranded assets because they just know this is all going to go away. So I understand why, for perfectly valid reasons, people want it to be true. But we've had a lot of evidence at this point, and it feels like that's another hole in the net zero scenario that's going to come back to bite us, which makes me, again, probably my own magical thinking we really need some of this stuff to work. And I think, as you quote Will Burns, if it doesn't, we're screwed, which I think is kind of where Will Burns was on the show recently. Actually, I'm kind of with him on that, but it's definitely, you got a much punchier quote than I got out of him for sure.
He's great. He's a really, really smart guy. It just goes back to what I said before. It's and that's what makes this an interesting time to be on this beat, is that there just are a lot of unknowns, and we look ahead to what, we know we have this kind of 2050 deadline to reach net zero. There's a million different types of pathways that you can use to reach that destination. And, people are, companies and governments are just placing their bets in a bunch of different areas, and hedging their bets in different ways. And the risk of that is that we're not going whole hog on any one solution, because we're not totally sure what is going to work or what we're going to really have the resources for. That was one thing that Will Burns told me when we were speaking. It was if we wanted to have a program where we just required companies to buy carbon removal credits, even if they're hundreds of dollars a ton, and just force them to do that, and really invest billions of dollars of taxpayer money into developing these solutions and like really, really, really have a concentrated push around this, then then we could say, okay, this is a core part of the solution. But we're not doing that now, and we're not doing anything close to that. So, and it's kind of, it doesn't seem very likely that we will, or that governments will take that approach for various reasons. So, it's just sort of like there's a lot of bet hedging that has to go on, and then at the end of the day, does that add up to like change happening fast enough? I mean, we just don't know yet. Oh, sorry, Richard. I think you were muted there.
Old guy on Zoom. You're on mute, granddad. Sorry. Oh, anyway. I was just going to say, I think the big open secret of carbon removals is that Microsoft can't be the buying 70% of the market forever, which is what they're at right now in terms of their share of buying these kind of forward-looking credits. They are, there's no public mechanism, but there's no mechanism to like require either purchase or that it's taxed to be then dispersed out of government funds like Denmark is doing. And, the Biden administration is going to buy a little bit of stuff around the edges just to kind of sweeten the pot for some of these companies. But at scale, it's just, unless there's something that break through, which is why I don't know if you've been following this thing in Vermont, the Climate Superfund Act that just snuck onto the books by accident. Governor Phil Scott, a Republican, neither vetoed it or signed it. It just kind of, Vermont had this little quirky little thing in his constitution that said, if you do nothing, it just goes into law. And that's what he did, which I think is like kind of, like his way of getting out of having to, answer to the RNC for why he didn't let it through. I'm sorry, I slept. I forgot the deadline. I don't know what happened. And now there's this first in the world kind of thing. So I think I'm wondering to see, I suppose everyone's wondering to see that, plus the litigation in California. 19 Republican AGs have petitioned the Supreme Court to block all those lawsuits, mostly based on federal preemption, but also going after the attribution science and the basis for it as the, kind of like, how can you can't say somebody to the gas station in Alabama is responsible for emissions that are going to damage something in from Minnesota. And well, actually, that's exactly what attribution science is saying. And we can, I tell you this, not down to a molecule level, but that's not how science actually works, dude. And we do use this all the time in other fields. So what do you think is going to be the bigger stories for the rest of this year? What are you keeping an eye on before we let you go?
Well, I think, everything you just mentioned with this Vermont bill or those, lawsuit in California or lawsuits that are happening in other places, I think there's a bill coming due for oil and gas companies that they are going to have to reckon with some of these issues in a much more immediate and financially impactful kind of way, which is probably, I think is part of the reason why they are, whether it's hydrogen or some of them have tried to do renewables or kind of doing anything they can to like try to reposition themselves as being part of the solution. And if you go to like these, whether it's Baker Hughes or CERAWeek or these other like oil and gas conferences, I mean, nobody is saying climate change isn't real, which is, that you used to hear that, or that oil and gas is like not causing climate change. I mean, you don't hear any of this denial stuff anymore because it's become like socially unacceptable or just untenable to try to make those claims. And I think they are very concerned about what their legal liability is going to be. So I do think that following like these various efforts to hold oil and gas companies legally or financially accountable for the social damages caused by their products is a huge story and is going to continue to be. In a similar vein, I think, the big story for COP29 summit this year is all about global climate finance and why the richest countries are not paying more to support the poorer countries to, cut their emissions or adapt to climate change impacts. Hopefully we'll see a bit more kind of innovation and kind of political will to raise more money in that space and really get that moving. That's going to be another big one, which is very much tied up to this carbon market stuff that we've been talking about, because that could could maybe be part of the solution, but there's a lot of issues there as well. So that's a big one. And then, obviously the U.S. election is, it's a pretty big story as well, and has the potential to, really change the path that we're on. So, that's going to be a really important thing to watch as well.
Yeah, I have to say, as a Yank, I've lived abroad for 25 years now plus, and I think sometimes I just try to not let it dominate my every thought, even if convicted felon former President Trump is reelected. I mean, I suppose it'll be really good news for the fundraising ability of your Sierra clubs and RDCs. Certainly was really good for the news business in the first term, because people are just expecting, hey, why not watch the end of the Republic live on television? That's going to be great ratings. Which if I linger too long on those thoughts, my mind goes to dark places. But look, Tim, you've been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. And I wonder, before we let you go, that we do ask people in an homage to Ezra Klein. We didn't really prep for this. So if you don't want to answer, or you don't feel like you could off the fly, we ask people for three things that have, they might want to share with the audience that kind of have influenced them. That could be books, that could be films, that could be experiences, that could be, but really shaped or reshaped your views on climate and climate tech. That have along the way, you said these are the couple of the things that kind of made you double down on this beat, really.
Sure. I mean, one thing that I think was really influential for me was a month and a half trip that I spent in southern Bangladesh, writing about kind of climate related migration and displacement on the front lines there. And just, that was an extremely impactful experience, really getting to a very, very visceral sense of what is at stake if we don't act. So that was a very moving and important part of my life. What else has really influenced me here? I mean, I think, this is not very specific, but I just think this, like, some of the tech is cool. So I just stay interested because I like seeing where this stuff evolves, whether it's, Climeworks doing what they're doing or any other company. I mean, I just I'm impressed by, this sort of gee whiz aspect of it. It just keeps me focused, and interested. I don't know. I'll come back. I'll think about a third one that, it's hard to pin one thing down. I've been doing this for a long time, but
no, I understand.
Those are two big.
I think, I think it's interesting. I think anybody who's gone through the experience of seeing a lot of climate effects up front in a place like Bangladesh, really has changed them. And so it's something that I expect as we continue this series and talk to other people, we'll hear more of that. But for the moment, people should definitely, if they haven't already, and if they haven't, shame on them, sign up for the Net Zero newsletter, Wednesdays and Fridays from Semafor, led by your good self, Tim. Anything else you'd like to plug before we sign off?
No, that's it. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all your time here. And sign up for Net Zero and stay tuned.
All right. Tim McDonnell, stay safe there in Kyiv.
Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate it.
If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delevan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delevan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.